So this lecture, you'll develop an awareness of the position of local government in terms of its relationship with central government, become aware of how different theoretical approaches explain or try to understand central-local relations, and that includes the concept of meta-governance, essentially the governance of governance. And we'll talk about how that can be a very powerful way of understanding how central government sees local government. And then we'll finally cap that off with a brief discussion about the role of contract negotiations or contract politics when it comes to the establishment of combined authorities and metro mayors. And that's something I want you to really think about over the next few weeks. Here's an image on the side for those who are still slightly struggling with the different types of local government. Here are the main types kind of surmised. But if you are still having any issues understanding or getting your head around any element of the course so far, please do speak to me and we can sort that out in my office hour. Okay, so one of the core features of local government in the UK is the level of centralisation that occurs. So central oversight of local government has increased since the golden age of local government in the 1930s, and perhaps accelerated since the Thatcher government reforms, which continued under New Labour and then the coalition. The House of Commons Communities and Local Government Select Committee report, The Balance of Power, Central and Local Government, made the claim that by 2009 this hadn't changed. Local government was not empowered, especially compared to the rhetoric of ministers, which made it sound like it was, and it was nowhere near as powerful as similar bodies in Europe. They categorised the discrepancies from the European cases in three areas: constitutional protection, central government intervention, and financial autonomy. Now we'll look at the first two sections in this lecture. The fiscal authority one will come under local government funding. At the end of the coalition era, academics such as Leach et al. Argued that by 2015 local government role is one that is best described as marginalisation. And to be honest, this doesn't really vary from nation to nation within the United Kingdom. So obviously in England, it's kind of where the focus of the report was, local government is still seen as the plaything of Whitehall, but even with local government devolved to the Welsh and Scottish assemblies, Scottish local government still has a lot of its powers held back by, or potential powers held back by Holyrood, who choose not to devolve them further down to local government. And in Wales, although there's often like nice talk about putting central government at the heart of decision making, and there's been some moves such as expanding the voting age to 16 and giving councils the option to use STV if they want, the actual powers, the range of powers available to local authorities isn't really on par with any kind of main Western European nation. And then as we know, Northern Irish local government is much weaker than its English, Scottish or Welsh counterparts. So this isn't just an England only issue, and devolution hasn't really solved or addressed the issue of weak local government, especially in a comparative European context. So due to the fact that the UK does not have a codified constitution, there's no constitutional protection for local government. Like everything else in the UK, local government is provided for through various acts of parliament, and as such can be changed through a new act or an amendment of an act. And this is all because of the concept of parliamentary sovereignty. Further to this, many parts or functions of local government which can be changed aren't just changed through acts of parliament. They could also just be changed by an order made by the Secretary of State, which naturally results in much less oversight than a new bill, with an aim to allow minor changes to, I don't know, how local government operates in some respect without clogging up parliamentary time. Now, these orders, you would think they'd be for kind of minor, uncontroversial issues, but they can be for actually fairly significant changes, including the creation of new councils or unitary authorities, which would be unthinkable in many European countries where local government units are protected by constitutions, or in many cases are older than the actual state, the nation state that they find themselves in. So what could be done to help protect the status of local government, since parliamentary sovereignty means that a constitutional guarantee is constitutionally impossible? So one option that Wilson and Game offer is to bring the European Charter of Local Self-Government, a charter from the Council of Europe, not the European Union, into domestic legislation. And this will create a statutory obligation for central government and other actors to follow the charter, unlike the kind of voluntary system of compliance we have now. For example, New Labour were criticised for pretty much forgetting about the Charter once it was ratified, and in the case of 4 of those articles, the New Labour government wasn't even compliant. Now, during the coalition government, the House of Commons Political and Constitutional Reform Committee produced a report on codifying the relationship between central and local government, and there's a link in the slide notes, and produced their own draft code. They also noted that whilst the idea of a code may in the UK case seem radical, local government in Europe has enjoyed constitutional protection for decades. As a result of a lack of constitutional protection, local government has found itself in a situation, according to Wilson and Game, of partial autonomy. So national governments can create, abolish and amend the powers of local government as and when they want, in a way, like I've said, that will be unimaginable somewhere like in Sweden or Germany. And so we'll see later how central government also finds it easy to pile on more and more demands onto local government without necessarily providing the funds to meet those demands or the capacity to meet those demands. However, Acts of Parliament are not the only game in town when it comes to the ability of the centre to manage local government. Acts of Parliament are primary legislation, and many require secondary legislation or regulations which clarify specific clauses of acts before they can be fully implemented by government or local authorities. Similarly, some acts give the Secretary of State the power to make decisions on an issue once legislation has been passed. So let's look at some of these. So the first one is statutory instruments. These tend to escape full parliamentary debate, but they are numerous, around 3,500 per year. Wilson and Game gave the example of East Harling Drainage District, Alteration of Boundaries Order 2009, the passing of which, without parliamentary scrutiny, is hardly going to bring down democracy in the UK. But these statutory instruments can also be used to create new authorities, such as the Cheshire Structural Changes Order 2008, which created Cheshire East and Cheshire West and Chester, both of which were single-tier authorities. They were also quite important during the UK government's response to COVID, which many within the Conservative Party felt was avoiding parliamentary scrutiny of quite big issues. But they're quicker than trying to pass an act. Statutory instruments were used or are used to implement regulations and directives from the European Union, for instance, and they can have expensive and wide-ranging consequences. So the EU Services Directive 2006/123/EC allowed local authorities to set up businesses in other EU countries, which the government calculated could benefit the country to the tune of £6 billion a year. 20% of statutory instruments are under the affirmative procedure, so Parliament needs to approve them, although it can't edit them. The other 80% are under the negative procedure. They are laid before the House and automatically come into effect unless the House annuls them, and the House very rarely does this. So you can see how scrutiny is avoided here. And then we have something called Henry VIII powers, and these are a specific type of statutory instrument that allows ministers to effectively amend or even repeal primary legislation, whereby clauses in a bill that enable ministers to amend or repeal provisions in an Act of Parliament using secondary legislation, again subject to varying degrees of parliamentary scrutiny. And the argument in favour of these is that they take up less parliamentary time than trying to pass a new act repealing an old act, and of course in passing them the House of Commons has granted the minister the relevant powers to do so. If they didn't want to give the minister those powers, they shouldn't pass the legislation. On the other hand, critics say it's undemocratic or it gives too much power to ministers who can escape scrutiny. Then we also have circulars. These are issued by government and contain advice and guidance on how to use their powers and meet responsibilities. Now, they're not laws per se, but departments can make local authorities or bodies take them into account in decision making, with the potential that if they aren't local councils can be punished for acting in a certain way. Now, obviously, legislation also grants ministers default powers, so a dissatisfied minister can step in to ensure a particular service is provided in a certain way, or transfer that power to another body or local authority. Nowadays, legislation often gives ministers the ability to intervene in service delivery and oversight without having to take councillors or councils to court. E.g., the Thatcher government had to take militant councillors in Liverpool to court in the 1980s, but nowadays, in a similar situation, a minister wouldn't. They can just step in. Monitoring and inspection of local government has also ballooned, especially under New Labour. Wilson and Game claim that under New Labour, an industry of inspection ballooned. So you have Ofsted, which look at schools, and stands for the Office for Standards in Education, Children's Services and Skills, and they brought together 15,000 inspectors and 4 bodies into one to form a kind of super inspector. And local government inspectors became a costly and cumbersome imposition which, coupled with Treasury enforced efficiency savings, stretched local authorities' budgets. So in 2005-06, PricewaterhouseCoopers report found that the average local authority was required to make 566 separate performance returns to central government at a cost of roughly £1.8 million. However, judicial review means that government decisions and local authority decisions are not sacrosanct. Courts can still quash a decision on the grounds that A, it is unreasonable, B, it is beyond the powers of the relevant body, or C, the decision was made improperly. But judicial review is often an expensive and time-consuming method, so councils don't take it lightly. Similarly, courts themselves have a high threshold for allowing through challenges to ministerial decisions. And so we also have ombudsmen. Individuals can challenge local government through the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, which is a service that investigates complaints from the public about councils and some other bodies providing public services in England. It also investigates complaints about registered adult social care providers. And it's a free service, but it is the last stage in the complaints process for people who have given the council or care provider opportunity to resolve the issue first. Similar duties are carried out by the Public Services Ombudsman for Wales, Scottish Public Services Ombudsman and the Northern Ireland Ombudsman. Now these, for example, are much bigger in Scandinavia. For example, Sweden created its first ombudsman service 158 years before the UK did, and in Scandinavian countries these public figures have a much larger profile. In the UK, ombudsmen in the public sector, but also increasingly in the private sector, aim to deal with local government maladministration. So they don't initiate their own legislation, but they do, increasingly anyway, feel comfortable in flexing their muscles and taking on broader issues emerging from a single case. Now, ombudsmen do have some powers in holding local government to account. For example, they have the same powers as the High Court to obtain information and documents, and their decisions are final and they cannot be appealed unless you think there's a flaw in their reasoning process, a legal flaw, and then you can challenge them in court like you can any public bodies. But if a council does not want to come to a satisfactory conclusion, so an apology or compensation, the Ombudsman has little power beyond writing a critical report. So in some respects they have quite powerful evidence gathering powers, but the actual ability to enforce their decisions is quite limited. So what I want to kind of get at here is that local government faces scrutiny from the centre, especially from ministers, but also from below through ombudsmen who aim to speak up for the individual. So firstly, it's important to remember that in the same way local government is not just one thing, it is a range of different bodies with different interests and different priorities and different powers, so too is central government. Numerous departments and national bodies can require things of local government, and they do not necessarily have to show joined up thinking or planning. In fact, some would argue it's the norm that they don't. There's also an element of trust required. Many ministers do not trust local government to be left to their own devices, and so feel the need to micromanage or overregulate. And, because of the lack of codified relationship between the two, they can. Wilson and Game identify 3 distinct phases of central local government relations. From the 1960s to the mid-70s, it was consultative. more central money for local government, but with local government left to their own devices. From the mid-1970s to 1979, the relationship was corporatist. So Labour governments tried to incorporate local authorities and local authority representatives to secure voluntary spending restraint. And in the 1980s, the Thatcher era, there was confrontation and control. Ministers legislated for greater central control over spending and abolished authorities which opposed them, either sell off their assets or hive them off to the private sector. And then the major government followed a process of conciliation. With financial control established, a policy of less overt aggression could be followed. When New Labour came into power, local government was predominantly Labour, and councillors hoped for a more equal relationship than experienced under the Conservatives. But increased funding came alongside increased oversight, inspection and targets. So you could maybe see that relationship as something like cash and control. You will get more money, but we will oversee you in various ways, and you won't be free to spend that money on whatever you want. We will attach strings. For Pratchett and Leach in 2004, they argue that choice is a reality and extends across a whole range of policy areas. Often it lies in the detail of implementation rather than in wider strategic directions. There's much greater discretion outside the priority areas, i.e. local government does tend to have a choice when it comes to delivering services or things or engage in areas outside of government's priorities, but when it comes to the priority areas themselves, there is much less freedom. What I want you to think about as well when we're doing readings and discussions is how this might have changed under the coalition. Now, some might argue that combined authorities, metro mayors, these are things that are done to local areas rather than necessarily done with or done by local areas. And what does that mean for the relationship vis-a-vis central government? So until 1979, with the election of Thatcher and her Conservative government, the partnership model of central-local relations had prevailed, albeit with the occasional conflict. And this was partly because leadership of a local authority continued to be one of the key pathways to becoming an MP, and so many members had experience of and sympathy for local government. However, Thatcher had no such experience and no such qualms with picking a fight with local government. The central conflict between Thatcher and the growing influence of hard-left councils led directly or indirectly to a range of central government initiatives. Rate capping, the abolition of Greater London Council and the 6 metropolitan county councils, and the introduction of compulsory competitive tendering that in other circumstances would probably not have been seen to be necessary. The conflicts generating these measures and the responses to them reset the parameters of central-local relations, and they launched the new direction of travel in a direction of centralisation that has typically continued ever since. However, there was nothing inevitable about the continuation of this centralisation. It could have been changed if government or key individuals wanted to. Post-Thatcher, there was a lack of interest on the part of prime ministers to empower the now weakened councils. In fact, they saw the benefits of using local government as a delivery mechanism for policies dreamt up at the centre, and would not enjoy the idea of rival power bases. So, for instance, see how central government and Andy Burnham, for instance, struggled over COVID relief money last year. Right? If that was a more common occurrence, it would make the job of being in government much harder. So overall, there was no long-term plan or plot for the consecutive weakening of local government. Instead, the trajectory of central-local relations can be linked to a series of ad hoc issues, which individual ministers have either felt obliged to deal with or have chosen to do so. Leach et al. Tracked the development of town planning, which is worth a read to contextualise the erosion of local government's functions in one specific area. And they show how policy is often developed in an ad hoc manner without an overarching sense of how local government should function, or what local government is for, or who local government should represent. In contrast, there have been very few pieces of legislation which have boosted the powers of local government. The Local Government Act 2000, which brought in the powers of well-being, the Localism Act 2011, which brought in the power of general competence, are key exceptions. Until the end of the 1970s, there was little evidence of hostile or dismissive attitudes to local government by either party. As Jones and Travers argued in 1997, continuous expansion of local authority expenditure in the period from the 1950s to 1975 had ensured that, by the standards of the mid-1980s, the relationship between local and central government was relatively smooth. But, for Leach et al., the pessimism of politicians towards local government and councillors since 1979 has seeped into Whitehall more widely. There's a snobbish attitude amongst mandarins and amongst politicians towards local government, which is shared by ministers and civil servants. Under the coalition government, local government escaped further tinkering until November 2014, when the then Chancellor George Osborne announced that he had agreed a devolution deal with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which, in a fun trick of history, comprises the 10 metropolitan district councils that cover the former area of Greater Manchester County Council, which was abolished in 1986 by Thatcher. So this represents somewhat of a departure with the snobbish attitude, since central government now has created big political figures with whom they have to negotiate with. However, there are very few new powers or funding streams created for these positions, and powers instead come from merging local council functions or devolving spending from the centre, arguably seen as a method of improving service delivery through increased local flexibility of funding delivery, rather than via improving local democracy. So far, this has been a descriptive account, right? If you just did this in your essay, you'd probably not be getting more than a low 2-1. Instead, what we need are analytical frameworks to fit these accounts in. One such framework is Robert's idea of narratives. Narratives are sequences of events, experiences, or actions with a plot which tie together different parts into a meaningful whole. In the case of local government, Robert identifies a vicious circle which is developed from narratives of local government, the effect of which is to encourage citizens to disown and criticise their local administrations and justify central government actors in policing and forcing change upon them. This explains why we've seen a continuation of the hostility and contempt through Conservative, New Labour, Coalition and now Conservative administrations since the 1980s, despite the discontinuity of actors at both levels. All parties are singing from the same hymn sheet or feeding from the same narrative. These embedded stories, these narratives, begin to create a narrative, which is slowly becoming common sense. Some examples are on the slide. So these narratives then become the context within which local government decisions are made, or in which politicians are socialised to view local government. And some of these might even apply to politicians in local government themselves, who maybe go into local office, who become a councillor in order to try to combat this. For example, if you think the local authorities are inefficient, you might become a councillor in order to improve efficiency within a local council, and you might think your specific local council does a good job, but local councils in the whole would still be seen as inefficient. So what is local government for? Before we look at the models examining the relationship between centre and local, we need to establish, or at least be clear about, our own normative views on the reasons for local government, or at least the core functions of local government. Leach et al. Identified two key conceptions: the balance between the two determining the powers and structures required of the local by the centre. And the two purposes are not incompatible, but it is important to be clear about which we perceived to be dominant or which should be dominant, what maybe various political actors perceive to be dominant, and so on and so forth. So the first one is the technocratic approach, and the key purpose of local government here is to deliver, coordinate and prioritise local services in accordance with national requirements. The consequences of this are typically larger authorities are good because of economies of scale, and professionalisation is good because the more professional councillors, the better administrators or better governors they will be. The second approach is the governmental approach, which sees local government as primarily there to identify and respond to the full range of problems, challenges and opportunities facing a locality. So The consequences of this are largely the opposite of the technocratic approach. Smaller authorities are good because they can more closely represent a specific community. And professionalisation is bad, or at least irrelevant, because local government should represent the community rather than be trained deliverers in services or administration, right? If you can get someone who represents the community, who is also a good kind of or more professionalised individual, well, great, but that is not the aim of local government. Now, in recent history, the technocratic model has won out, right? That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. And that's why we have large councils compared to most of Western Europe, and fewer councillors per person than any other major Western democracy. These councils do not represent geographically distinct and identifiable communities, but instead are created to meet a size demand sufficient for efficient, self-sustaining service delivery. The prioritisation of the technocratic bigger is better model can be tied to Robert's narratives concept that we covered earlier. So the GLC and upper tier authorities were abolished for political reasons, but under the guise of being wasteful. There was a claim that there was nothing that the GLC and metropolitan counties could do that London boroughs and metropolitan districts couldn't do. However, the fact that regional fire, police and transport boards had to be set up shows that perhaps some services should be delivered at a regional level. There's elements of complicity with civil servants who began to view large unitary authorities as the best structural solution, because there's an advantage to civil servants for dealing with 100 to 150 large unitary authorities rather than the 350 or so widely varying selections that currently exist. Significant numbers of chief executives and council leaders saw opportunity in the acquisition of unitary status for their authorities, a bigger budget, higher profile leadership position, a larger chief executive salary, and ultimately more power. And so this technocratic model tends to have a fair few powerful advocates, whereas those who are arguing that local councils should be smaller tend to have a more of an uphill struggle, and no big beasts coming out to bat for them. So hopefully you've seen how the relationship between central government and local government is not unidirectional, although the power balance between the centre and the local is heavily asymmetric and skewed towards central government. However, the relative strength or the balance of the centre-local relationship varies over time and across different policies. It's not just a simple top-down line management relationship. Remember, theoretical frameworks are, by necessity, simplifications. They choose to prioritise some element of the real world over others, but you need to use them in your essays to provide analytical rigour and to avoid being purely descriptive. And they can also form the basis of your evaluation by critiquing the models themselves. So the agency model, which is the first one that we'll consider here, sees local authorities as completely subordinate to central government, arms or agents of the centre with little in the way of agency of their own. This aligns with the idea of local government being bypassed in the localism agenda, with an emphasis on local partnerships, non-elected bodies, etc. However, if this were fully the case, it's not clear why there would be such a variation between authorities in terms of policy and spending priorities. Although central government does exercise tight financial control, it does not produce uniform spending patterns or service performance, e.g. unlike tax, welfare, benefits, which should be delivered uniformly across the country. So, local factors, priorities, competence do matter clearly, and that challenges the idea of the agency model. So next we have the power dependence model, and this developed from the partnership model, which sees central government and local government as broadly equal partners. Now we know that's rubbish, and constitutionally we know that to be incorrect, unlike in other countries. The power dependence model takes this partnership model a step further and argues that both central government departments and local authorities have resources which can be used against one another and against other organisations. So this understands power in relative terms, with a process of bargaining and exchange inherent to it. Now that's not to say the powers are balanced either. But councils aren't at a complete loss like they would be under the agency model. They do have their own resources and they do have their own forms of power, be it hard power or soft power. So they have a moral or electoral power as representatives of a local community, which can claim to be the most in tune with constituents' needs rather than a distant government department. This framework anyway has the advantage of not seeing either player as a monolithic whole, but has the downside of underestimating the dominance of central government and its inherent superior power in a country with uncodified constitution and parliamentary sovereignty. It also doesn't tell us much about how we can measure relative power and how this might vary from policy area to policy area. Okay, and then the final one from Wilson and Game anyway is policy, community and networks. So both of the previous models have had very little to say about bodies beyond local authorities and central government departments. But we know local government is comprised of a range of bodies delivering services and oversight, especially in an era of local governance. Rhodes argues that we need to look at the interrelation and ecosystems of what he terms governance networks. Policy communities are important when understanding the delivery of local services, e.g. the people devising policies and delivering services in the education field will be very different to those in the care field, who will be very different to those in the planning field, and they'll all have different objectives and incentives and frameworks within which they operate. And so our framework for understanding central local decisions needs to appreciate the difference between these policy communities. So as you can see on the table, there is an overlap with the power dependent model. Policy development and service delivery is still based on exchange and bargaining with power asymmetries present. But there's a trade-off here though. Although the policy community framework is more accurate, it's a more accurate description of real life, it's also messier and its findings may be less generalizable and less applicable to other policy areas. And it also might not be very predictive. It might be better as an explanatory framework rather than explaining how trends within a policy community or a network might develop over time. So yeah, when you're thinking of these frameworks, think about whether they have explanatory power, whether they have predictive power, and what the weaknesses inherent in them are. Okay, a final way that you'll notice this lecture is shorter than other lectures, but that's because it's quite theory heavy and I'd rather you spent a bit more time reading up on these different frameworks than listening to me talk about them. So a final way that we'll look at to conceptualize the relationship between central and local government is through the meta-governance analytical framework. So meta-governance is essentially the governance of governance, or how governance networks are created, how they're shaped, what incentives are used to structure them, and how those networks are perpetuated. So Bailey and Wood examined the case of devolution to metro mayors and essentially argued that the Treasury has structured the deals in such a way as to only allow the combined authorities to carry through policies the Treasury supports, mainly in the realm of boosting economic growth and improving public services. So, combined authorities thus represent a technocratic rather than a democratic reform to local government. Their aim is to boost policy output, not to represent people. And it is argued that this is done through network design and network framing. So network design aims to influence the scope, character, composition, and institutional procedures of the networks, in this case through the creation of devolution deals, whereas network framing seeks to determine the political goals, fiscal conditions, legal basis and discursive storylines of the networks, again through the creation of deals, where conditions for success and failure are outlined in terms of delivering economic growth, for instance, or increasing skills, increasing housing. In this understanding, the governance of governance networks is conducted by the central state as a privileged, although not uncontested, site of political authority, which is long established in the British political tradition. And so, it is the central state that provides the rules and the context within which local governance networks self-regulate. So central government defines the acceptable behaviour and strategies, and so the state is the meta-governor. Essentially, it sets the framework and then leaves local government to do what it wants because it has already set the rules to ensure that the outcomes will be beneficial or will align with central government's views or goals. So, Under this argument, devolution to English city regions is part of a technocratic understanding of the role of local government, and they aim to turn these bodies into effective and efficient drivers of economic growth, with an elected, accountable individual at the helm, rather than meaningful democratic bodies. This is because the constant justifications as devolution, as breaking the one-size-fits-all approach of existing bureaucracies, and empower local actors to focus resources on frontline services. Instead of representing a fundamental shift of power from Westminster to the people, what we really have, according to Bailey and Wood at least, is a minor technocratic recalibration of delivery and even some notable process of centralisation. Now, this is good for the centre, because it does not remove or prevent local government from being a tool to deliver centrally defined goals, i.e. regional economic growth and a reduction in regional inequality, but it does shift accountability and blame for any policy failures to the local level, vis-à-vis the combined authority. And so, what we have is, in a time of austerity, the British state has been taking with one hand and giving with the other, but with strings attached. So we can see that basically the central government has said to these devolved administrations, and in other policy areas, just to councils, right, you can operate within this framework that almost makes it impossible for any other incentives to exist than what we want to happen. But if you fail, it will all be your fault. Or if the policy outcomes don't deliver the benefits that we hope, you will be blamed. We can also see this in the concept of policy dumping, which is the transfer of formal policy responsibility but not effective policy responsibility, or the shoring up of central control through the co-option of local elites in these governance frameworks. And what policy dumping really means is giving local councils new powers, but either restricting the way that they can use those powers, so they can only use them in a way the central government approves of. E.g., for example, the general power of competence was given to local authorities, but the Secretary of State can, at any point, if local councils do something they disagree with, prevent them from acting in that way, right, using a standing order. So they get formal policy control, but not effective policy control or responsibility. And often they don't get full funding to see through the policy responsibilities they have been given. Finally, other scholars have noticed the role of contract theory, of the power of the centre, and of the prioritisation of technocratic governance over local democracy when it comes to devolution deals for combined authorities. For Sanford, devolution in England is not understood as a constitutional or territorial policy, as in devolution to combined authorities is not understood as a constitutional territorial policy in the way that devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland is, but as a series of contract-based outsourcings of decision-making with a limited amount of attention paid to governance, geography and broader questions of funding. In the sense that central government, say, might contract out a contract to Serco, say. Now they're just contracting out certain powers or functions or responsibilities to combined authorities who have pretty set goals to deliver, i.e. economic growth. And the best part is, really, from a central government perspective, they don't need to punish combined authorities for failing, because the way the system is structured means that voters should do that. Okay. So, on the other hand, though, Sanford notes the speed of change generated by devolution deals is favourable to the slowness of the previous 20 years, and that output legitimacy might be possible through effectiveness and demonstrable outcomes. So output legitimacy is the idea that something becomes legitimate because of the outputs they deliver, right? So dictators rely, I mean, this is probably not the best example, but dictators rely on this a lot, okay? Think of the common phrase, oh, Mussolini, at least he made the trains run on time. This is the idea that a leader might not be democratically elected or might not, which we call input legitimacy, but because they delivered outcomes that are seen as good or desirable, they get an element of output legitimacy. Again, the Communist Party in China deliver economic, or many dictators, if you deliver economic growth, the public might accept you anyway, even if you haven't been elected. So it might be that over time, as a metro mayor digs in and they get things done, they will be seen as just as legitimate as the local council, for example, and they might outgrow their current role as an agent for just delivering economic regeneration. Now, maybe this is what we've seen with Andy Burnham versus the central government standoff over COVID resources. The path-dependent nature of the growth in combined authority powers, which once a government creates a position, creates a body, such as a combined authority with a metro mayor, the government isn't fully in, or Whitehall isn't fully in control of the direction within which that will grow, or the direction within which that body will evolve. Okay, lots of other factors then play a role, including the people who hold that position. Okay, so we've covered a lot of theory, and we've covered a fair bit in this lecture. So what I'd like you to do when you do your readings is to think about what we've covered and think about how different councils fall into each framework, where the frameworks are strong and where they're weak. Think about policy areas where this might apply to, and try and think about maybe other elements of the political where you see similar patterns emerge. Okay, that would be really useful, I think, and it would also help you evaluate the pros and cons of them vis-a-vis the local government sphere.